Welcome to 60 meters propagation in the Canadian Rural Zone presentation for the Radio Amateurs of Canada 2021 virtual conference. I'm Sean Smith, Victor Echo 6, Sierra Alpha Romeo. Okay, so a little bit of background on 60 meter band to start. In January 2014, Radio Amateurs of Canada announced that Industry Canada had granted us approval to 5 channels in the 5 megahertz 60 meters band. There were some caveats to this. The primary use for the band was to be used for emergency communications. So we had interoperability between military and government agencies who also use the 5 megahertz band. It was channelized, which is not normal for our radio service. And our power is limited to 100 watts ERP. Now, south of the 49th parallel, especially closer to the equator, military and commercial services gave the 5 megahertz band the nickname of the rock star band or the rock band, because no matter what seemed to be going on, day or night, it seemed to be open to somewhere. But unfortunately, there's very little publicly available data when it comes to the propagation of 60 meters. So where this project started, this propagation study we're going to talk about. After the Slave Lake fire in 2001, the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, the need for reliable HF communications in the northern communities that are a little more isolated than a lot of these southern communities became very apparent. Fort McMurray itself never lost commercial communications during the fire, but Slave Lake did. And if it hadn't been for the response of numerous amateurs, they wouldn't have had communications into the townside of Slave Lake for several days. Okay, so after the Fort McMurray fire, Al Parsons and Matt Lewis, who had both been in the Emergency Operations Center for the first week and a half of that fire, contacted myself and asked me what my thoughts were on the 60 meter band and what I knew about it, and if I thought that it might be good for emergency services use. So I did not know any more than they did, so we started researching the possibility. That's where we found out there was very little publicly available data. Any data we did find was for lower latitudes, especially right around the equator, where you don't have the same effects from the rural zone, or the same effects as we have up in the rural zone here in northern Canada. So because we didn't have any data, we couldn't find anything, in the spirit of amateur radio, we decided to do our own experiment. So we came up with some objectives of our experiment right from the beginning. We did suffer from some project creep, and at points there it was a fair bit of project creep, and we had to rein ourselves back in. But I think that's normal for any project in our hobby. So our main objectives were to evaluate the viability of the 60 meter band under real world conditions using the limitations that were placed upon us. So max 100 watts ERP. We assumed that at least one end of the communication circuit would be in an urban area at an EOC or provincial EOC, where they would be suffering from S6 to S9 plus noise just because they're in an urban area. And that the teams that would be deploying to these northern communities wouldn't have access to towers and beams, so they would be doing basic wire antennas that were designed for NBIS. So inverted Vs mounted low, or dipoles mounted 2 to 5 meters above the ground. The communications mode that we were going to use for this experiment needed to be something that facilitated the passage of two-way message traffic. So that discounted modes like whisper, which although is great for propagation studies, it is only a one-way transmission. And even at that, it's fairly slow, so it would not be practical to be used in emergency communication. And lastly, we needed a way to quantify our results. We've all sat around the ham coffee or the ham breakfast and been involved in the discussions or listened to the discussions on which band works better when, under what conditions, but nobody around the table has any quantifiable proof as to back up their claims, I guess we could say. So how we selected our mode. There was a bit of a process to this. I'm going to give you the Coles note of it. This was actually happened over several weeks before we finally decided on the mode. There was a lot of research done and then some experimentation. So the initial connection attempt was between Al Parsons, V6 RFM up in Fort McMurray, and myself, V6 SR over in Grimshaw, which is 5 hours northwest of Edmonton, Alberta, for those of you that don't know your Alberta geography. So in a straight line, that's 384 kilometers, so well within the NVIS range. So our first contact, the band seemed to be doing well, so we tried SSB, but both of us had a fair bit of QRM on each end, and you could hear that the other person was in there, but it was not readable at all. So we switched to PSK 31 since we were both had our stations configured for doing digital already. And at 50 watts, there was absolutely no copy. You might hear the odd tone, but there was definitely no copy. You couldn't decode anything. And I had just been reading about the Olivia mode and how it's supposed to work really well in poor conditions and high noise conditions. So we gave it Olivia 4-250 a try at 50 watts again. And it was a perfect copy. Didn't drop a single character. We talked back and forth for 10 or 15 minutes on that mode. And then we want to test to see, well, let's see how low can we go? So we kept cutting our power in half, so 25 watts, and then down to 10 watts, and then finally 5 watts. And at 5 watts, we were still getting a perfect copy. If you turned up the speaker on the radio, you could not hear any of the Olivia tones, but we weren't dropping any characters, and it was a completely perfect copy. When we're doing this, we're actually sending screenshots back and forth over our phones to make sure that we weren't losing anything. Now, Olivia, I know, isn't the fastest mode out there, and the way we looked at it is, in an emergency, the priority is to get the message out and to get it out accurately. Now, obviously, if you've got better conditions, modes like WinLink and AirDrop are superior, they're faster, there's a lot of advantages to them, but they don't work as well in the high noise environments or the poor solar condition environments. In 2020, we started this project. I should have prefaced this in 2016, fall of 2016. So in 2020, roughly 4 years later, because it was the end of 2020, when JS8 call became mature, we switched to that because, one, it worked better at lower signal levels. It easy as 10 to 15 dB lower in the signal to noise ratio that it works. And there's a lot of other advantages to JS8 call from the emergency perspective, but that's not the point of this discussion today. The other advantage of JS8 call is that actually gives you a receive signal strength report, which when we get into data analysis makes things so we can analyze it even more and further dissect what's going on. Okay, so our experimental setup. Okay, so the first thing we need to come up with was, how are we going to send out beacons consistently from a bunch of different stations and not have them double on each other? So we started out using the FLDigi macros, and what we learned with the FLDigi macros is they do not restart the timer till after the message is sent. Now, when you have a bunch of different call signs, the duration it takes to actually send the message is slightly different because different characters take a different length of time to send. So it didn't take very long when you're beaconing every 30 minutes. It was 4 or 5 days, and you started having stations that would double up on each other because of the creep. So we had to come up with something else. FLDigi does have the ability as an API that you can use to control from external software. This is how some of the other software things in the FLDigi suite talk to it. So with that, we were able to write 2 different solutions to do this. I wrote a script in Perl that would watch the time, and you would toll it every time at, say, 15 minutes after the hour and 45 minutes after the hour, and it would cause FLDigi to transmit one of its macros exactly on time within a second. Matthew Lewis, VE6BHC, wrote a Windows-based one for people involved in the project who weren't using Linux or Raspberry Pis to control their beacons. So we had that down. So then the next thing, we need to figure out how to record our beacon reports. We'd already been using PSK Reporter to see who could hear who and things like that. So I approached Philip Gladstone, N1DQ, explained our project to him, and asked him if there was any way we could get access to his data or his data feed to get those reports. And he gladly gave us access to his full feed, and helped us out writing a script to actually watch that feed and grab out the information we want, filter it and grab out the information we want. Now, just a little note, when we started using this, so that probably would have been late 2016, early 2017. This was before FT8 had really taken off. And the data coming out of that was already like a 2-inch fire hose, like amazing amounts of data coming out of it. By the time we stopped the data collection portion of this project at the end of 2020, early 2021, that was more like a 10-inch fire hose. The amount of data that is generated by FT8 is unbelievable. It really is. But that's just a little bit of a side note. We were having some hard times filtering. We had to work our script a little bit to make it more efficient, work faster, to actually keep up to the data coming through. So now we had our beacons going out when they were supposed to. We had the beacon reports. So then we searched and found most of the FTP sites with the relevant solar data from various government agencies. I have a list at the end of the presentation here. So we wrote a set of scripts with Perl and PHP that would automatically, every 15 minutes, go and grab the latest data, process it a little bit, and put it into a database. So now we had our scripts that were beaconing, and they were putting into the database when they sent a beacon. We had the scripts grabbing the information from PSK Reporter, who were also reporting to that same database in a different table. Then we had all our solar data in tables and database. So we ended up having it all in one place. And we did have some issues with that, which we'll discuss at the end of the project, or at the end of the presentation here, but it worked really well. So the high-level overview of our data, and today we're going to go over some of the initial results. We're still analyzing. There's a lot of information, as you can see from this slide. So we had 175,740 beacon reports saved in the database when we stopped the data collection portion of this, which I would have to look at the exact date, but I believe it was in January 2021 is when we stopped actively beaconing and collecting data. Beacon transmissions in the database. So these are all Olivia beacon transmissions using the FL Digi timing script. 200,988 beacon transmissions. And I did some filtering of the data to get this next number. But our Olivia beacon receive rate at the lowest point of the solar cycle, because remember the last 4 years have been pretty dismal on HF, was 65.7%. So that's, to me, that's pretty good considering how bad our propagation's been over the last 4 years. And then for solar data, we have 4.8 gigabytes of solar data, and that's even with some missing because we had some issues here, which I'll later in the presentation we'll go over. Okay, so for data analysis, originally we started using a package called Grafana, which produces graphs quite easily using different types of data sources. It's web-based, so everyone involved in the project who wanted to have a look at the data could look at the data. It was easy to use. The hardest part of using Grafana is figuring out the database queries, but realistically, someone who's worked with any kind of package like that before could probably on their own pick it up in half an hour. Someone who's never used a package like that, with a little bit of assistance from someone who's used it before, could probably have it mastered, or not mastered, but at least usable within 4 to 5 hours. It's a great package. And one of the advantages of this is it could directly access the database. So we didn't have to worry about an intermediary scripts or programs to grab the data and filter it and reformat to put it into Grafana. Recently, we started using R and R Studio to do statistical analysis of the data. R, for those of you that aren't aware, it is very similar, similar programming language to Python, but it has been tailored for analyzing large data sets. This is what universities and research institutions use in a lot of cases to do all their research and analyze the data that they've taken. It's a very powerful tool. I haven't even scratched the surface of what it can do. And it's got a very steep learning curve. It's not only are you learning a new language, in my case, and the other people involved in the project here, none of us are data scientists and none of us have a background in statistics. So we've had to learn statistics at the same time. And our data analysis is still ongoing. Once the winter comes this year, and I'm not tempted to go spend more time outside, I'm actually inside. Probably a lot more will get done over the summer here. It's been spotty depending on the weather outside. If it was rainy, I got some done. If it wasn't rainy, I was outside doing stuff. Okay, so here's some screenshots that I gathered from my Twitter feed of our beacon network at various points. This is pretty typical, what you saw here. We did have some VE5 stations and VE4 stations that were beaconing for us and receiving for us for a period of time. You can see them here. But for the most part, it was this group of Alberta stations here that were doing the bulk of the beaconing. Okay, so this is the first slide shows us some actual data that we've analyzed. The first thing you're going to note is there's a bunch of peaks in here in the data, and that's because that's where the receiving stations were. There is unfortunately not many stations listening on Olivia 24/7. One other thing about this graph, this finally cemented in my brain. I've been licensed over 20 years. I think I figured it out coming up on 30 years. It finally cemented in my brain how bands go long at night when the F2 and F1 layers combine and raise up because they're combining, and changes that angle of incidence of your reflected signals. So what we can see here is up to about 450 kilometers, which is kind of that golden NVIS range. If you do any reading on NVIS propagation, during the day, 60 meters does better than at night. So that's what we're seeing here with these pieces of data here. Once we go through gray line and get into the nighttime, it definitely goes longer at night. Not significantly so, but enough that it shows up on the screen here. Okay, so some of you are probably wondering what's 450 kilometers? That was 4.5 hours of driving at 100 kilometers an hour. So I made up this quick little map here just to kind of demonstrate. So Edmonton, where our provincial EOC is in Alberta, if we had a station there using NVIS, and this is under conditions when NVIS is working for us, we're not in the middle of a solar storm or something, this is 450 kilometers. The radius here is 450 kilometers. So you can see we cover the bulk of the populated area of Alberta. Medicine Hat's on the edge here, Lethbridge is here. Then up in the north, Grand Prairie would be around here. And Peace River, where I am, is over here, and Fort McMurray is over here. So with the station in Edmonton, theoretically, we should be able to cover most of the province. If we had a couple more stations across the country, we could cover most of the southern portion of Canada with probably a half dozen stations. Now, the Arctic communities, they got some more distances to deal with. But say for Yellowknife, if they want communications, we would just need to have a station set up in either Fort McMurray or Peace River, and Yellowknife would be covered quite easily. Okay, so solar wind is going to be the first solar parameter we're going to look at. So on this side here, we have the wind speed versus distance. Each one of these dots is a received report. So you can see the more they're clustered together, the more stations were, or more beacons were heard at that point. So you can see the solar wind speed does have an effect on the distance. We do have some erratic stuff here from some stations down in the United States or Eastern Canada that received our beacons. But the bulk of the stuff was out to about 3,500 kilometers, 3,700 kilometers here. You can see once our solar wind speed starts approaching kind of 500 here, you can see it starts dropping off on your distance, and you have a better chance of doing your short distance, your NVIS distances. Again, we have these spikes because of where our receiving stations were, which kind of throws things off. But even when our wind speeds were kind of out at the extremes during solar storms, we were still getting some through. So you're not completely wiped out when there's a solar storm. Now the wind density, it's a little bit more dramatic. You can see we have long distance here up until we get approaching about 20 on your wind density. And you can see suddenly the long distance drops off, but your NVIS continues to go until you get up fairly high on your wind speeds, or wind density, sorry. Okay, interplanetary magnetic field angles, or IMF angle. Okay, so the three main ones that most people look at, or that are usually presented when you see solar weather reports, are the BZ, BY, and BX. The BZ is the most critical of the three, as you can see from this graph. So as long as your BZ angle is between about +4 and -5, you're pretty good out as far as you want to go. Again, like this 4,000 where it drops off here is just because of where receiving stations were. Not a lot of people monitoring Olivia. But you can see once your angle starts moving more to the positive, you get above about 4, it drops off pretty dramatically for your long distance, and even your NVIS drops off. We could actually see this when you're watching the beacons, because when we were beaconing, and especially if we knew there was a storm coming in, we were all checking our FL Digi on a regular basis to see who we were hearing, and we're checking PSK reporter to see who we were hearing. But on the negative side, sorry, it's still fairly robust for NVIS until you get down to like -10, -11 on your BZ angle. The BY angle is less critical. You can see it's a little bit wider here. You're good out to easily the +5, +6 on your distance before it starts actually starting to restrain your distances. And even that, your NVIS is still good, getting up to towards +15 on your angles. On the negative side here, it is way more robust, and like you're solid even to your out to distances here, down like -7, -8, or -6, -7, I should say, and your NVIS is good down to like -12, -13. We have solid NVIS coverage. The BX, I mean, it did drop off a bit, but just because of the angle, the BX angle, the way it strikes the Earth up in the north here, it actually has not as much effect. There is a bit of a drop off here once we get above +5 and below -5, but it wasn't as critical. This one here, you can see it's fairly wide. It didn't really, the signals didn't really care much about this one. Okay, sunspot numbers, just because this is one of the numbers you always hear coming up in conversations. This graph does have a couple erratic ones here that will probably need to get filtered out at a later date of the data set. Now the sunspot numbers I used here, I could not find an online database that had the daily sunspot numbers listed that I could do, but I did find through Natural Resources Canada Space Weather Center. There's a formula that they have derived after looking at decades and decades of solar data, and they've come up with a formula to to calculate this, and it's on their Space Weather Center page if anyone's interested. I do have a link to that at the end of the presentation. But you can see, as long as your sunspot numbers are fairly low here, you can work short to long distance, and this is all, remember, done with NVIS antennas. This isn't a dipolar beam up at 80 feet. This is down on the ground. I had inverted V. Al had he kept switching between an inverted V and a dipole that was mounted about 8 to 10 feet off the ground. A lot of the other stations were using dipoles at various heights or inverted Vs. But you can see once our sunspot number starts getting up around 25 here, then suddenly the long distance drops off, and we start seeing it's still solid on the NVIS till we get up about 50. And then it's actually kind of weird. The short distance NVS drops off, but the median distance, so we're going like 400 to say 800 kilometers here, was still fairly solid. Okay, so here's a screenshot from our Grafana system in quiet conditions. First thing you'll notice is there's a couple spots here where it's straight line because there's data missing. And this is because the data sets kept moving on us due to different policy decisions made by various governments and government departments. They kept moving the data on us, and sometimes it took a while to find it. And then when we did find it, it took a while to figure out how to adjust our scripts to taking the data, because sometimes they changed the format of the files the data was in. But you can see in quiet conditions, everything's fairly consistent. You got your wind speed in the top here, your BZ angle right here. And you can see there's a bit of variation, but it's not that much. And then on the bottom here, we have our Northern Hemispheric Power Index. Again, it kind of spikes up a little bit, but it's still fairly consistent in what it's doing. In the bottom panel here, though, these tall lines, this is every time a beacon was heard, and this would have been by VE6JY, and it was beacon sent by VE6RFM. Now, this square wave you see, or roughly square wave you see here, is actually day and night. So you can see this, the time period here was June 24th to July 6th. So that's during the longest days of the year. So that's why we got this big gap, or we have the daytime here is fairly long, the nights are short. And there is a few gaps here, and this may have been due to lightning storms, and I'll disconnected a station. But you can see that it's fairly consistent. There's a few days where it's a little light, but it's fairly consistent. Now, the next slide here is during a solar storm in end of October 2019. The graph goes from October 23rd to November 4th. So you can see our wind speed. Just before the storm arrives, it drops down and then picks up. You can see the BZ angle actually becomes fairly stable, and all of a sudden it just goes crazy during the solar storm. And our Northern Hemispheric power spikes as the storm arrives. And what you will see on the bottom here is we were actually pretty consistent right up until the storm, and then it drops off for roughly 3 days here. But even then, we were still having some periods where we were getting some beacons out before it started to come back. And one thing we noticed, and we were trying to find a graph that would represent this. But as the solar storms are coming in, they appear to form almost like a bow wake in front of them. And as that bow wake strikes the upper atmosphere, it increases the density of the atmosphere and makes it more reflective to RF. That's why about 2 hours to an hour before a solar storm, you have that unbelievable conditions where you can talk to just about anywhere in the world on a wet noodle, and then all of a sudden the band shuts off. And that's because you have that bow wake compressing the upper atmosphere, and then all those charged particles finally contact the upper atmosphere and wipes us out with noise. And you can see that pretty clear here with what's happening. You can see right down here, it's really good, especially right before because these are 1 day, these graduations here. So you can see that just before there we had really good conditions, and then it just dropped off suddenly. Okay, problems encountered. Our data sources kept moving. I mentioned that. We had a small number of beacon stations that weren't well distributed, and the volunteer beacon stations weren't able to consistently beacon. This is for various reasons. Tying up somebody's HF radio 24/7 for 4 years is a lot to ask. Okay, so I'd like to thank all these stations that beacon for us or provided some other kind of support during the project. VE6JY, he dedicated one of his SDRs pretty much the entire time we're on the project there to listening and decoding Olivia for us, and then JS8 call. Our data sources, PSK reporter, Space Weather Prediction Center at NOAA, Space Weather Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and NASA, of course. Here's our contact information. If you have questions after this presentation, or you want to help us out with the data analysis, or any other feedback you can give us about this project. We do have a website where we are going to start posting some of our results on as we get them in a format we can put them up there. Al can be reached at this email address, or he's on Twitter. I'm at mycallsign@gmail, and I'm on Twitter with my call sign. Thank you very much. Have a great day.